So here we go. We're holding on the Omud of Tov Reish Nun Tes in the second volume, Ois Shin Kof BEIS, in which we began discussing the fourth inyan that we set as our aim to discuss, which was Koya V'Poyo. Having completed the BEIS B'Nageh to Etzem V'Spashtos, we then began the inyan of Koya V'Poyo. And we were holding on Tov Reish Nun Tes around about the middle of the Omud. And we reached the conclusion that but we saw that there were several madrigas, as it were, in Koya V'Poyo. And the Koya, we saw that all of our pu'ulas are determined and governed by a Koya Ruchni Kloli within the Guf, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu planted in the Teva of the Guf. But that's a Koya Ruchni called the Koya HaTanua or the Koya HaPoyo. Sometimes we use that expression here in the Maimah. The Koya HaTanua HaKloli is a Koya Kloli which is moved out completely from any Shaykhs El Geshem V'ha Metzias Ha'olam Kipshutei, and it's a Koya Kloli V'atzmi from which is Nimshach all the spiritual Ruchnisdike Koyches which mania the Avery Haguf Ashayochim Lapula Ha'i. And then the Rebbe wanted to say that there's different madrigas in the Koya HaPoyo Ha'atzmi itself, and they're more individual to certain areas of the body, like in the Yad or the Yodayim. We saw there was a Koya HaTanua Ha'atzmi V'Kloli in the Yad, and then there's Nimshach, more specific Koyches Ruchniim להימשך ולהזכלס בעניינים פרטיים בנוגע to the כוח היד. דהיינו the אצבעות. And the אצבעות, they carry over the כוחs פרטיים which are נמשך לכל אצבע מהכוח התנועה העצמי שביד, and that is mania the etzba hagashmias, and causes it to move. And then there's a further inyan bezeh that it causes later a matzias gashmi, that the movement of that finger affects a certain inyan in the olam hagashmi, boifen mo'od meduyak and specific. If we're talking about a pu'ula mechuvenes alidei ha'odom, and then there can be more simple and pshitasdike pu'ulas, but they also, one way or another, affect the olam hagashmi. The Rebbe made the point that those ruchnisdike specific giluim of koyach ha'poyo, koyach ha'tanua, shebekol inyan, which are nimshach into the Eivorim or Tnuas Protium, then they're called Pu'ules Legabi they're also called Pu'ules Legabi de Koyach HaKloli V'atzmi HaRuchni. And we say the reason why is that the word Pu'ula is a Shem indicating a Hamshocha Mi'al Etzem Lasois V'lahaves Eiza Matzias or Eiza Dora. Lifoil. What lifoil means an activity chutz me'etzem, in the Matthias around the etzem. So therefore, even those koiches ruchnium, which appeal the inyanim aprotium, benegir to that particular koyach hakloli, in that particular aver or section of the body, or they're called pu'uleis, legabi the koyach ha'hiyulia, or I'm sorry, the koyach ha'tnua haklolias. And on that basis, we tried to find how would that koyach upoyo fit into the hierarchy of the four inyanim klolim that we mentioned, and how would it relate to other inyanim that we find in those four inyanim klolim. And like we've seen on more than one occasion, at the beginning there was a Kosel HaDaitach to compare it to the Indian of Hiyuli and Gilui Mi'ahiyuli. And that's where we were holding approximately, or we were holding a little bit after that actually, but I think if we come in there it'll be easier for us to get the flow. But this is about a third of the way down the page that we see there that he says, "U'komei kol hiyuli she'ein boi hagiluim b'matzias." And in that respect, it seems to be similar to the Indian of hiyuli, because every hiyuli doesn't have the giluim mimeno b'matzias. It's just like a potential producing point for those giluim, but not that it has them b'matzias. So, "Komei keinu b'koyach Tenua Atzmi." Now, when he uses the word Tenua Atzmi, he can be referring even to one of the more specific koyachas Tenua Kamaybi Adayim, which is the Moshe we're choosing here. She'ein boy Tenua is b'matzias. It doesn't carry all the tenuas that it's going to do inside itself. It's not like a huge collection of different movements. Because we see that the number of movements that one can make from that koyach hatenua are mamish unlimited. There's no limit whatsoever. There's all sorts of movements that can come about in all sorts of manners and ways of expression which are completely different. And shoinim zemizeh, v'gam lo yigmoyer, v'yagbil puloiso. And the koyach hatenua will not limit it, will never limit and hold back the number of pu'ules. Afila, a man were to live 1,000 years or more, it wouldn't, there would be no limitation in the koyach pu'ula. Harun is that could produce and continue producing b'li kol hagbola klal the number of pu'ules. Yeah, the kamoisha etzem koyach hapoyo, just like the etzem koyach hapoyo. Yeah, lo yichle kol zman shehu chai v'kayom, just like the etzem koyach hapoyo, I mean the koyach hakloli of koyach hatenua will never cease from a mensch as long as he's chai v'kayom in the world. Kach pu'uloisav lo yichlo. In the same way, the number of things that it can do in bo'im shel pu'ula inside the olam misoviv also have no limitation to how many they can be. V'hainu she'einu mugbalim lo b'ha'eicha shelehem. They're not limited in what you might call the teichen panimi, or the quality, as we might say, the kavanah or the teichen in them. Sheyochel yis become Ifanim Shoinim. He can do all sorts of different types of pu'ula, which will carry activities, meaning or wanting to achieve certain inyonim. V'leiva hakamat shalehem, also not in the actual physical number. V'hainu mashaloi yichle hakoyach. We see that there's nothing which limits the koyach hatanua except the inan of chayim or heip of mizeh chas v'sholem. But the siman of chayis is that the ability of the koyach hatanua just to keep her ha'atzmias, just to keep going and giving forth from itself ruchnestik giluim, which will move the Ivorim or the pratistic Ivorim Lafi Inyan Rotzen from Koyachahu. Ve'im hoyu apiules, aino hatnues, aprotis, nimtsoim b'matziusam, b'hakoyach hatnua atzmoi. If all the different pullers were there in some matzias, inside the koyach ha'pa'ula atzmoi, Harei behechreach SHIUR bagbola. We'd have to say they must be in some form of agbola in the two drochim mentioned above. Dainu eichus v'kamat. Dainu shetiyeh hagbola bo'even atnua shezehu be'eichus atnua v'zehu be'eichus atnua. והפעולה תהיה רק באופן כמו שהוא כלול במקורו. In other words, that the actual movement governed by, even by the Ruchnistic Koyach, governing the whole thing and having in mind the bringing into Gilui of a certain, how do you call it, Koyach, or certain activity, a certain Pa'ula, well, that would be governed. The quality of that wouldn't be just unlimited to the type of quality according to his desire or his aim at that particular moment, but it would be governed by what he had in the wardrobe in there. In other words, it would only be according to what sort of thing he had inside the koyach atanua ha'atzmi. Yeah, so therefore he said they would only be able to be even kamoishahi klula b'm koira. That's in the Indian of the, you wouldn't be able to just make unlimited, meaningful and toichen to get tenuas. You would have to go according to what tenuas you had stored in your koyach tenua. V'gam said b'kamas hatenua sheyichle v'yufsa koichoi kami v'gilui me'ahelam. He said, ultimately speaking, it would eventually have to cause a hefsek and a hagbola in the gilui of the koyach tanua and the pulas mimenu, just like we saw in the concept of gilui me'ahelam, that since the helem is nimtzo shom, be'ez shumatiyas inside the helem, then there had to be nichle koichoi. Why? Lefishahu b'matzias be'ahelem, shegam hu mugbar. Since even though he's in the higher state of his helem, he's already got a certain matzias inside the helem there, then he's mugbar, according to the type of matzias that he has there. Is remember, shegam hu mugbar. Therefore, he can't really be compared to the Gilui HaHelem. Ela she'einam nimtzoim sham klulim b'matzius elamai, that they're not all the different pu'ulas, how they are, and they come out from the koyach hatanua, are not to be found there in any form of identifiable matzias that we could just say they're klulim inside the koyach hatanua in a higher or more delicate even, but they're really some form of already determined matziyah. That we can't say. In the other direction, so So now we're finding that it's not like Gilui Ahilim. So that makes sense, as we said, because the union of Gilui Ahilim implies a certain Metzias even inside the Hilim. And if it was a certain Metzias, it would be necessarily Mugba, with all the results that come from that. So Imkain, it would appear to be very similar to Hiyuli for Giluim Mimenu, because there you have in the Hiyuli not in any state of Metzias at all, and then they come out in even of Gilui, in the Hiyuli also not in an even of Gilui Hahelim, but they come out in a very different way than what they're including inside the Hiyuli. So maybe we could compare the Koyach to Hiyuli. Omnam, he says, it's also not big to compare to that either. We see that the Indian of Agili Minayuli, we had that in the previous chapter, doesn't come just in a flowing and automatic way from the state of the Hiyuli into the Gili. V'kamoi Gilui v'yischachmas mekoach amaskil shetorik yagir. We've spoken many times about the classical dogma of a Hiyuli is the koach hamaskil. Dahainu, the koach kloli prior to the actual Gilui Askola in the Moyach HaAdam, which begins with the Nekudas Askola, and that comes from a state of presence inside the Hiyuli in a way that it's not there, Beklal, in any form of given Metzias, the way it comes out. And that's the Mila or the Indian, that a Koach HaMaskil, that it's moved out from all the Giluim Mimenu. It's only just that it's there, as it were, in order to produce in an unlimited fashion also the number of Gilui Hasichli Mimenu. It would appear that one could compare it to that in of Hiyulim Giluim Mimenu. However, he begins now drawing the first thing that's noticeably not similar to the Indian of Hiyuli Vagilui, because the Ika Indian of Gilui Mea Hiyuli Shaloi is davke through effort, davke through struggle and effort. Ulafiomin lo yoyo yagam hayagia shagam imreite, even if there's this rotzen, which is l'chera the dover animta behind all tunuas and all pullers and all inyanim, is the Indian von rotzen. He said, but we see in the Indian von Hiyuli Vagilui that sometimes even when a man says mityageya himself, but even shall yigia amitis vamuchim, it's at his abilities, it doesn't necessarily work always. Shegam imreitel is chachem umiyageya umatrechatzmei, and he makes big efforts within himself. Nonetheless, we see that not necessarily is he gonna Yaskil have the first Gilui at the infant Chochma v'Yitzchachem. He will have the Gilui of that into the Koyach HaNefet. Mashen came b'Koyach HaTanua. He said, well, it's not like that in the Koyach HaTanua. Gesheroitze lahania aribo HaTanua mamela. If he already reveals the Indian Arotzen, like we said, that the Koyach HaTanua in that respect is like a Hiyuli, that it's only if there's a Rotzen mitzad the Odom, then it will work. However, like we see the famous Moshe brought in many Jewish exodus, the miyad, when you want to move, then your hand just moves, or whatever aver it may be, it just moves, but there are mamela. He said, so that's the obvious difference in Cain, between koyach v'poyol and hiyuli v'giloi. What is the cause or the reason behind the whole inyan? Masha hagilui min ha'hiyuli. Hu biyagia. It has to come dafki through an effort and a struggle. Nizbua li'il perik shin kofara. That's the previous perik. Shazel midna shagilui dahainu asikliim. If we take the classical dogma of the hiyuli, which is the koyach hamaskil, then he said the gilui dahainu asikliim AIN b'matzias dover. They already have a very specific inyan which determines their matzias in a very individual way. That when any seichel comes out, that's like a very delicately necessary matzias, which is not something else. And one of the secrets of genuine understanding and genuine askola is to differentiate from one sikli to another and not to confuse them. As in kain is it gamma koyches aprotium, which is not the case in the koyach hatznu as well, since he said in kain, if we were going to compare it to hiyuli, gamma koyches protium shal hatznu shahina pulois שהם גם כן בבחינת מציאס דובר, הרי היו צריכים להיות בהם גם כן אין היגיע. But if we were going to say that they were mamish bedimian to the hiyuli, then there would have to be in every koyach hatzanua some form of necessary yagia or forcing or stooping of the koyach hatzanua that should be able to present itself or to carry out the action that you will require. However, we see that that's not the case. So he said it comes out that it can't be compared exactly to the inyan of koyach, the inyan of hiyuli v'gilui mimeno, because in not being present at all in the state of the mokia dahainu, the hiyuli, or in this case the koyach hatnua, that they are similar, but the even hagilui is very different. The be'ika is the kuda being tolui in the inyan yigia, and that yigia being tolui in the fact that each one is a specific inyan. So there has to be an effort on the part of the hiyuli to be madaic very carefully through yigia to produce that particular idea and reasoning in an exact way. Mashenkein, we don't find that in the inyan of koyach upoyel. Why not? He said, ach ein adema hamatzias, the koyach upoyel hamatzias, the hiyuli v'gilui. Because l'choira, the kasha now is that the pu'ula, which is nimshach into the olam hagashmi, is also a matzias dover, and it's also a specific pu'ula. So l'choira, that matzias is different to the matzias of a sichli or a seichel, which is nimshach from the koyach hamaskil. So he says no. He says it's not comparable, even though they look to be very similar, but they're not really. He said, "Ein adema amatzias to koyach upoyel amatzias." Well, the scene of us being a specific, limited inyan, and amatzias dover in the way it comes out, is not similar how it is in hiyuli, the giloi, to how it is in koyach upoyel. The shom, meaning over there in the hiyuli, ari koyach kol giloi uba hagbola. Umatzias miyuchedet. Over there, every inyan is dafka with a precise limitation and a very specialized individual. I would translate the word miyuchedet in the sense of individuality. It's a very individual inyan all on its own. Kamoy ashikleim ari kol seichel umatzias miyuchedet. It's a very individual and tremendously demandingly special inyan bifnei atzmai she'ein adima asikliim zeh lezeh. The one seichel is not to be compared to another, and it's very much necessary that way in order that we should specificize and differentiate and be able to know exactly the clarity of that particular inyan and what differentiates it from another idea. He said that tenuis aprotiyas, when they do all sorts of individual tenuis, they also do come into the world in a limited and specific way. They're pu'ulis from the Koach HaTenua or the Koach HaPoel HaKlori, and they have a very specific aim and content to them. Mikol Mokim, nonetheless, he said there's a big difference. Einim b'matzias miyuchedes b'fnei atzmam. They don't have that inyan of being a matzias miyuchedes b'fnei atzmam. Dahainu, that they don't have like an individual in themselves, which makes it very, very different and unable to be compared to another inyan. Why? He said the kol hatnui shovei saying, v'hareihem k'moi koiches peshutim. He said all movements, in the fact that their movements are all equal one to the other. In other words, if you move your fingers in a delicate way, or you just move your leg in a general way, they are just movements of the body. And even though that movement of the finger may have a certain speciality of a certain sort, differing it from the movement of just a general movement of the leg or the arm or he said, however, since they're just movements of the body caused by they're not like tremendously specifically individual in their very essence, which differentiates them one from the other, but they all have a certain general, what each of them is like a dover poshet. It doesn't have in itself any specific entity. It may eventually, through the interference of the moichin and midas and other inyonim in a movement, it may eventually, in the actual pa'ula, it may cause a certain, ultimate like writing and things like that through its effect in the Gashmistic world, governed by the inyan of moichin and midas and other inyonim, it might produce a feeling and an idea and a concept in writing or kiyetavazeh. He said, however, the actual movements per se, going out from the koach of Atnua, are all them poshet inyonim. They're all similar in the way that they're movements. Umikol mokim, area pu'ules ein b'chinas matzias, each but the pu'ules mamish, but we pointed out that even the individual koiches ruchnim are also called pu'ules. Pu'ules ein b'chinas matzias, or b'frat, k'moishe boim b'ha'pula shenitfeses b'zeh, once they already come into the actual pula itself and they become nitfes in the gashmias, ari boim b'chinas matzias, they do come in some form of matzias. He said, "Umasha boim b'chinas pu'ula, ugam kemasha maniyim esa geshem hayad." Like we said, there's like two madregas that the actual ruchnistic individuality of any pu'ula is also called a pu'ula. So that in that first stage of being still under the general name of a pu'ula, they just move something in the Gashmistic world. They don't actually produce some inyan which is nivdal legamri from that movement, and that's through the intervention or giluim of other koiches like moichin and midas and kavona, etc. But the actual movement or koich which causes the movement, which is also a pa'ula, but that's, all of them are pshutim. In other words, that all movements of the guf have an inherent similarity of simplicity, that therein it is just to move something. Like that, what they can carry out a very specific, what you might almost call expressive Matthias in the world. Well, that's a dover nivdal mehem, that they put all that through the Tanua in a dover nivdal, the gamma. V'imkein, ari l'choira, but the actual movement per se is a simple common inyan in each movement. V'imkein, ari l'choira, v'hechreich, oy tzodik lois b'zeh yagia. If we're going to say that sof kol sof, they do produce a inyan of some sort of specificality, then l'choira we should find in that also, since they do cause a dover nivdal, in the dover nivdal, they do cause a dover specific mamish, then maybe at that later point we should find in them the inafenigia. So he says, so the Rebbe is saying l'choira, that's what should have been. And now there's like a parenthetical remark, like a bentayim remark, and that is, and he said, "U'b'mokim achem mavua, dezeh shekoyach u'poyel bo b'li yagia, zeh b'tnuah pshuta," what he wanted to up till now to time the Lord, or tnuah pshutim, but he said there are certain tnuah pshutis, bo shalei b'kavona. It doesn't come with a kavona sanefesh, but even miyuchad, with a certain intention and a certain, that's the idea of kavana. So we can differentiate in our actions between things that we do just moving the limbs and so on without any particular purpose, or something we do with a very specific purpose. He said, "Aval, b'tnuah b'kavana, ari tzarich liyez b'zeh limud v'hergel." So we see that something that you do with kavana, some movement of the body that has a kavana, you have to have in that what he call instruction, and that leads to accustomedness. You have to teach the body that it, and the actor or that particular limbs and so on, that it should function that way, and even become accustomed to doing it. So imkain, from that we would see that there's a difference, that there's ordinary simple movements, but there are movements which they have the inif kavana, and they should come, and they do seem to come if they need this inyan of continually teaching your body to do certain things, then that would seem to be an inif yagia. So he says, no, it's not really. When we call mokim AIN adema lahagilui, להיולי וגילוי, שהרי לאחר שמסרגל, אין צריך עוד לימוד והרגל. ובא בדרם המלך, after you've taught that part of the body always to react in a certain way, and always to be disciplined and not just react the way it would do, מצד טבעי העצמי, מצד כוח הפעולה העצמי, no, you've encouraged, you've brought it out in a way that it comes now through an instruction and accustomedness. However, we see that once you reach a certain level in life, then those Evarim will just do what you taught them, but they'll do it without any necessary yagia. And he puts in brackets of koya misasik. There's a certain inyan in halacha called a misasik. When you get to Melechet Shabbos and all the inyanim adimim was there, and that means where you no longer, you're so accustomed to doing a certain inyan that you no longer really put any kavanah or any particular meaningfulness of yourself into it, because your body just does it almost automatically. And therefore he said that's what we call a misasik, but oisa malacha mitzad regilas. But there's such a inyan in the Hilchas Shabbos or Eid Mekaymes, where there's a certain what would be from the beginning a sort of deliberate and well mechuvendik pu'ula, an activity. It becomes like a hergo. It's possible to do that in a way that your body will just do it automatically almost. In other words, a masasik, which is very similar to in Hilchas Shabbos, to the Dover She'einu Miskavin. He doesn't really need to have any kavanah anymore. He said, Avo behiyuli v'gilui ari tzarik tomid yigia gam kishemis lameid. He said, we notice, for example, in the Inif and hiyuli v'gilui, if we take once again the dogma, the koyach hamaskil, and the infant, the sickly, and mimenu, even if you become used to a certain type of seigan, a certain type of learning and a certain type of usage of your mind, but it never sort of just goes in a way that it's taught itself, and it acts almost, as it were, semi-automatically according to how you taught it. But every time you do it again, you have to have a certain yigia to get to the proper result. And if you don't, then just rely on what seems to be hergo, then you can end up missing the main point or not getting it beklal. So we see that Emsa usually always needs a gear, it can function through a way of accustomedness and not necessarily through a gear. But that tends to indicate that it's different than hiyuli v'gilui, and so it demands some sort of closer definitional inyan. So therefore he says, we have to, and we're obliged to say, that there's some other reason why a koyach ha'poel is different from a hiyuli v'gilui mimenu, and there's some other inyan, not just purely the inyan of lack of yigia or yigia. There must be some other inyan. He said, why do we have to say that? That so-called the comparison to hiyuli doesn't work. We don't really have as a definition of why the koyches from the pa'ulas come out the way they do, and why they're really different from all other inyanim, including hiyuli v'gilui. Meaning we need a more, as it were, definite and carefully defined inyan to describe to us the way that koyach ha'poel are an individual. So he says, that we don't need the infant yigir beklal, and that will differentiate it from hiyuli v'gilui mimenu. He said, v'hu masha koyach hatznua kvar mukhan v'hu beteva hazois lahaniya kol tnuis begilui davka. He said that this, we have to say that the nakuda merkozis in this is that the koyach hatnua are klodias, even though, as we described before, it doesn't have in itself any specific tnuas, and it's not just a huge collection or wardrobe of all the tnuas. It's moved on mihem, and yet nonetheless we have to say that Hashem made it in such a way that koyach hatnua is already mukhan in itself, be'etzem tivoi, yelahaniya kol tnua begilui davka, to move all sorts of movements in a way that they will enter and affect the world. And since that koyach is made in such a way, al pi teva, that it's near to that whole inyan, therefore you don't need the infant yigia. You don't need struggle and effort, because this koyach is different now than hiyuli, because hiyuli is muvdal, and therefore since it's muvdal, and the inonim which come out from it are specific of the things that come from koyach u'poel are also specific. The ikar inyan over there is that they're completely meruchak, and since it's a inyan complete meruchak, it needs a gear. Over the way the koyach u'poel was made by the Eibishter, there's a certain nearness and what you might call general preparationness and general preparedness inside the koyach hatznua to that inyan which comes out of it, the movements which have a certain ability to affect the world and to make inyanim sheyesh lehem matzias. Mashenkin in hiyuli v'giloi. Mashenkin, and also he says that the bekiru to the tnua, shekva huchan. It's already been made originally from Hashem to be, as it were, ready for these type of tnuas in a way that will just produce them, but mamela, compared to the way they come from hiyuli v'giloi. Yeah, he said, "V'ein b'chinas kiruv lehem." I'm sorry, where are we? Mashenkin b'koyach hiyuli, shehu rak hiyuli lahagilui hanimtzoim mimeno. V'ein b'chinas kiruv. He's just a hiyuli, meaning a withdrawn potential koyach b'li kiruv, and he's not in a name of kiruv lehem liyois muchen elagilui she'ir hagiluim v'dera mamela mimeno. If he were muchen b'kiruv, then to the infant siklim, then they would just jump out the whole time in an infant mamela from the koyach hamaskil. El masha muchanu, masha kvar nimsha, mikoyach hamaskil, koyim shabo, b'pinas giloi mamis. He said, masha muchan is what we do find as something that's already gone out of the koyach hamaskil, and that comes into the brain of the Odom before the inyan of Mamish Gilui. In other words, that there is a certain trace of the koyach hamaskil, which is Muchan Gilui, but that's not in the koyach hamaskil itself. That's something that's already come out of the koyach hamaskil into the brain of the Odom. And that's like a door that's not the seichel b'golu yet, and it's like a sort of preparatory stage for it. He said, but that's already gone out of the koyach hamaskil. He said, "V'hu masha koidim shabo nekudas askola begilui," until you get the first real gilui from the koyach hamaskil, nirgash b'moiche directkeit. You feel in your moyach, and you become aware and sensitive that you're about to understand and appreciate and get some very flashing gilui about some inyan, and you sense the correctness and the inner power of that message before you actually get it. In other words, say, I'm sort of now beginning to feel and see this, and then when the Nekudas HaSkola reaches you, you say, oh, now I've got this. In other words, there's like a certain positive awareness of that whole inyan, Or he says, it may not even be a sense of the correctness and the yashras of the inyan. It can be kamoi nitzutzei oyer. It can be like sparks of light. Shemeirim b'moichei. He sort of just feels that something's beginning to light up in his brain and come towards and show him the right way. So the Rebbe says that's who bechinas keser shebechokma. Keser is if we talk about chitzin, is a keser al kaponim, or that's the inyan of the koyach hamaskil. So he said that's the inyan from keser shebechokma. That's the way the keser is given a certain madrega from itself, and it's come down into the very first madrega of chokma. In other words, that's even before the inyan from chokma mamish, in the form of Nakudas Askola, and that's called Keser Shebechokma. In other words, that's already in the spheres within Chokma, that's already Keser Shebechokma. The Koyach HaMaskil Ubchinas Chokma Shebekeser, or Masha Muchan Ubchinas Keser Shebechokma. She said, however, the actual Koyach HaMaskil, that's well known in Eter Barikin, the Hemshech Eter, near the beginning. He describes Barikas over there. That's what we call Chokma Stimora, and that's the Madrega of Chokma Sheba'arik, and that's already Chokma, how it's Nimtza Bekeser. And Mashu Muchanu, what is already Muchan to come into Gilui, Bekiruv, already, although it's not real Kiruv, it's not the Koyach, the Nakuda scholar yet. He said that's already Keser Sheba Chokma. That's already the Keser, how it's already there in parts of a Chokma. And there, the Inivan Koyach HaMaskil, well, that's the Inivan of Chokma, how it's called in the general parts of a Keser. So you got him Kain, you got the Inivan Chokma Sheba Keser being a Mokir for Keser Sheba Chokma. Chokma to Koyach HaMaskil, Ubeklolas, Ham Shochosei, Shanim Shekliya is Mocha L'Seichu Goloi. Yeah, or being you're right, that the Inyan of Koyach HaMaskil, generally speaking, if we compare to the Koyach HaYuli Atzmi Shebenefesh, then it's already been Nimshach in order to be a Mocha L'Seichu HaGoloi. Avo Loi Shehu Muchan, but not that it's prepared and ready for that, yeah, Agiloi, Adarabba, Hu Mushlau Min Agiloi, היינו מהסיקלים הגילויים, וזה שאינו מוכן, וזהו שאינו מוכן. It's mushlau bentayim, and it's eino mוכן. In other words, that the Eivus makes was certain koyches ikrim by the Olam, dahainu the Inyan of Koyach HaChokma, he makes that function in such a way that it has to come precisely through Yigia. Therefore, its mokev, which is a yuli imushlau, from the meaning of the Giloi, and it can only come about through the Yagia, and that's what we find in certain places, that's compared to the Inyan of Evan HaChalomish, and through the Inyan of Yagia, which is like hitting the Evan HaChalomish, you get the spark of the Keser Shebechokma. However, in Koyach HaTnua, it's not like that. You don't have to work in order to make a positive movement. It just comes b'derech toitzua mi'elov mi'retzoincho. Im ata rotzeh, zeh ma sheyeh. V'zehu, he says, gufa ma she'asiklim boim b'iyiskatzes mimenu. And therefore, however, in the Koyach what do you call it? In the Koyach Maskil, therefore the siklim that they come out of the Koyach Maskil, they come in a way of iskatzes. You get a new idea, it's like a new lightning flash in your mind, or in the earlier state, which is called Mukhan, where you sense something and you're aware of something profoundly in your moya. It said, but ultimately the full Gilui is Aish Chatzes. In Meisha Koyach HaMaskil, Ein Mukhan. Ela Gilui, it's not built in such a way that it's just like a ready state for that. Ein Shu Mushlo Me'asikliim. It's still mushlo from the actual gilui of specific sikliyim. Okay, na sikliyim ein befinas ischatches. Therefore, the siklim that they come out of the Koyach HaMaskil, they're in a state of ischatches, something new altogether, some new Inyan which appears in the autumn like a new, like says, oh, he's got the new gilui. He said, Shazehu Gamkein Tam Aligia. That's the same reason. That since they're distant and they're not Beklau Koriv, Alagilui, therefore you have to have the Gilui. Canal, and that's what was Mashma in Perek Shin Kofala. Mashainkin Bekoyahu Poyel, Arinian, the Koyach Muchan, it's built in such a way that if you would just reveal your Rotzain, then kilo b'terem mamayla and beliko yagia v'ishtadlis, the Koyach Tanua will produce the poyel hamatim lazeh, because the etzem koyach harukni ha'atzmi is made in a way that b'chol it's korov and has a nearness in itself to the giluim aboim mimeno. Yesh hakoyach muchan el hagilui, v'al kein hagilui eno b'chinas yagia, and therefore it doesn't come through struggle and through effort, but just through letting it know, kilu, what you want to do. So according to this, it comes out that the pu'ulas mi koyach tnua, koyach hapoyel ha'atzmi, are also not really anemase hischatzus memenu. He said, "Obemas einu b'chinas hischatzus k'may agilu min ha'yuli." They're not k'may hischatzus like the gilu min ha'yuli, like we just pointed out. That's a real hischatzus. Aber mikol makim, nonetheless, koyach u'poyel hariseh b'chinas hischatzus yesa mi etzem v'hispashtus. Etzem v'hispashtus was just like a hara atzmiyas from the mokeh. Therefore, that was a hischatzus, but not in any form of real hischatzus. And here he says this is more hischatzus than etzem v'hispashtus. Mipnei she'atnuas proti is boyim b'chinas metziyas. And the real reason for that is that they still do come in some form of metziyas. V'einam, slicha, the boyim b'chinas metziyas, mashenkin in etzem v'hispashtus, it doesn't come in any form of metziyas, nor it's in a name of an AIN soif upshitas, like we saw in the dogma of the Arasoive Kolalmi. Aber mikol makim al zeh b'chinas hischatzus yesa me'etzem v'hispashtus, mipnei she'atnuas proti is boyim b'chinas metziyas, which is not true in the etzem v'hispashtus. Ve'einam b'chinas hischatzus kol kach k'meyesh me'ayin. This will all be explained in the coming chapter, where he's going to sum it all up and put this all into some sort of careful hierarchy, which is more similar to which, and which is the Mamutzois, and which are the two extremities, and so on. We'll see about that. BEIS Hashem in the coming SHIUR. We'll start on the final loss of the Maimah. So I have to ask your forgiveness, all of you. I tried to fit in as much as I could and reach the end of that chapter, as I have to go now to since Shabbos by day I haven't been to any of the Shabbat brachas, and there's a Shabbat brachas tonight not far from here, and they're probably waiting on me to appear, so I'll have to ask you guys to forgive me.